I'm going to give everyone a quick overview of some changes we've got coming up for 3.17 in the authentication space. We've had a few ongoing issues, so I'm going to just quickly start with an overview of a bit of history to set the scene. In the beginning, Octopus did authenticated users only with username and passwords, and life was good. Then came the dark times. We introduced Active Directory. Still in the authentication space, probably our most significant source of support tickets and supporting that. I'm going to go into a bit more detail about some of the specific issues that we've been seeing recently in a minute. And even more recently, we've moved towards the light. We've added the ability to do OAuth authentication with our users. So that's sort of the quick overview. During that time, the way we've represented users has evolved quite a bit. There's a couple of key features that drove some changes in this space too. Subscriptions was one of them. For those who haven't used subscriptions, this allows you to send emails to teams based on particular events occurring or detection of particular events occurring. So it revolves around knowledge of who's in which teams, and that one's become particularly problematic with Active Directory. I'll detail more about that in a minute as well. In 3.5, we also added the ability to support multiple identity providers being enabled at once. So in earlier versions up to 3.4, you could have username and password, or you could have Active Directory enabled. As of 3.5, you can have both of those enabled and then also enable the OAuth providers like Google Apps Send as your AD. As part of doing that, we introduced an extensibility model, and that decoupled Octopus from any real as much knowledge of what was going on. That's led to a couple of the issues that I'm going to talk you through now. So the core things that we've been trying to address just recently with the updates for 3.17 are in these couple of spaces. So there's some performance things that have repeatedly come through, and these relate to when users log on, there's frequently significant lag between when they sign in and when they actually get to the UI, because in the background we're talking to Active Directory. This usually only happens when the Active Directory provider's involved, because certain Active Directories, depending on how they're configured, are very large, have a very large number of groups, and take the APIs that we call into in Windows can often take quite a long time to crawl around and talk to all trusted domains and all sorts of things and then give us an answer. So one of the things we're looking at with 3.17 is taking that penalty away from the user and shifting the checking of those groups off the process, so where the user's logging in, moving it into a scheduled task. So instead of the user paying the penalty, there'll be a background task that runs periodically. It goes through and checks the security groups for all the users. If you're creating a user, you'll also have to pay that penalty because we want to know the groups as soon as you create the user, but that's aside. A couple of the other issues that we've seen over time as we release 3.5 and some of the subsequent releases, the admin command on the command line used to have knowledge that Active Directory, when Active Directory was involved, and it used to do a few different things about looking up the users in Active Directory and working out their identities and hooking up UPNs and things like that. When we decoupled everything, we also disconnected and decoupled that ability, which caused us some grief. So the admin commands then weren't wiring that stuff up. So we didn't always know that accounts being used for admin were actually going to be coming from Active Directory, because we assumed they could also have been just username and password accounts. So there's been a few issues there. We had another bigger issue with the service accounts. If you've got a service account set up in Active Directory and it's in groups, and the groups are relied upon to get it into a team, or make it participate in a team to get access to projects or things like that, you run into trouble, because that mechanism that I talked about before for the performance of checking the groups when you log in, that doesn't happen for service accounts because they never log in. So this idea of shifting the checking of the groups back onto the scheduled task helps us fix that problem, because it doesn't matter whether the user's actually ever logged in interactively, we know who they are. There's some other mechanics that we've introduced that I'm going to demo in a minute that help us work that out, and hopefully they'll make more sense when you see the screen. There's also some upcoming issues with the way we want to model users for Data Center Manager and hosted Octopus. I'm not going to go into too much details, but there have been some underlying drivers, and a lot of the things that we were have been looking to do for those to solve those problems are actually what we've now implemented and are looking at in 3.17 and what I'm about to demo. One last slide just to talk more about this. What we've done is, as the users evolved and changed shapes, one of the things we did in 3.5 was we always looked at the users and went, now that we've got multiple providers, we really should have multiple identities or understandings that there are multiple identities out there related to those providers. At the time, we seemed to be able to make things work without upending the user world, so we made the decision to not rock that boat at the time. In hindsight, that decision is what's led to these couple of issues, so we're addressing it now. As I've mentioned on the way through, so the groups are now updated on a schedule, and this is also something that we've been talking about for a little while, and is also something that once we move into the Data Center Manager world, was going to become more important anyway, because Data Center Manager will take on that role of checking the groups and then handing things out, information out to the spaces, for those who've read about Data Center Manager and spaces. All right, that's the end of the boring slide deck. What does it look like? So a couple of things happen now. When you're restarting Octopus, a few things happen. So we've got a synchronization task. So I've spun my server up here on the console so you can see what's going on. And when we spin up, we synchronize any external user groups. And you can see here in my test database, when I spun it up, I had 11 users. And so it's run off and talked to Active Directory. I should apologize if any of the text on here becomes hard to read. I am running inside a VM to get to an Active Directory environment through remote desktop. So the external groups are there. So what we've now modeled is, on each user, there is a list of identities or login information. So similar to what you see in some of the things like Stack Overflow and things like that, you can manage multiple identities attached to your account. I'm just going to log in as the admin for a moment to show you some of the things in the UI. So I'm logged in as an administrator. If I go to my profile now, this automatically happens when you log in after you've upgraded to 3.17. There's no real migration of things going on. It auto adapts the data as it recognizes what's going on. So if you've got existing Active Directory users and the usernames match a UPN in Active Directory, and the next time you log in to Octopus, it will recognize the external identity and it will create this information here for you. So what we've got is the modeling of identity records. So in this case, it's picked up that this is actually a user from Active Directory. It has this user principal name, same account name and display name. We're modeling these fairly generically behind the scenes, a bit like the claims work in OAuth. So you can have any number of claims that have a description and a property. You can add new claims, add new identities. So for example, maybe you're trying to add a new Google app identity to this account. So the providers themselves implement some interfaces and answer questions about what type of identities they support, what claims they support, and what information they allow entry of. So when I pick things here, it displays those and asks for them and won't let you save until I've entered some information in the identifying fields. So it knows that our email address is something that uniquely identifies a user, so it makes sure you've got at least one of those values entered. For Active Directory, this isn't the UI part for this isn't quite complete yet, but this is the idea here is that if you pick Active Directory, you don't have to just type a username and hope that it's right anymore. The idea will be you type a partial username here and hit search. The APIs for this search are all wired up at the back. I just haven't got the UI built quite yet. But it will run off and do a search in Active Directory and return you identities that represent the users that match that result. And then the idea is you can pick one of those and add it to the list. So I'll give you a demo of adding a user to show you a bit about some of the things that happen during this process. So in my Active Directory, I've got a user called SpongeBob. So the username is still used as a fallback mechanism to line SpongeBob up. If you don't tell us anything else, we will still have a go at trying to line this up. Now we have some other interfaces that the auth providers are now implementing that lets us do searches. So if there's no identities provided, we'll ask them and say, hey, does this person look recognizable to you? And they may or may not be able to find someone. If they do, we'll hook it up automatically. So in this case, we've got an Active Directory user called SpongeBob. So if I add this user, something else you may notice here, the passwords aren't required anymore as a required field. The password here is only used by the username password provider. So if you don't put one in, it just means that you can't log in with the username password provider. If you do put a password in here for Bob, for SpongeBob, he could log in through the forms auth in Octopus with SpongeBob and this password, or he could log in with SpongeBob and his Active Directory password, and either way would work. I'm not too sure if too many customers know about that particular feature yet. It's not something that we've talked in great detail about in any of the docs. So for now, we'll create that user and we get SpongeBob. And when we go back and have a look at SpongeBob, what it did was worked out that that's actually this Active Directory user. What it also did, I'm not going to try and show you this, but what it also did was talk to Active Directory at that point and also retrieved SpongeBob's groups. So as soon as he was created, we know which Active Directory user he is, we go off and grab it. So this fixes the problem that we were talking about earlier, where if we create a service account and wire it up to Active Directory, the groups will now get loaded properly and we won't have the previous issues with them not being in the correct teams. I can also, now that I'm editing Bob, add so if I want to add an external one that's also SpongeBob, and maybe he's also SpongeBob at octopus.com through Google Apps. So I can add that identity in. So that way then Bob can log in with either of the providers using these details and will recognize him as the same user. Same things now work with this username like I did with the username from the admin command on the command line. So if you were just to say admin -- username SpongeBob, it would actually correctly work out who he was now and would create the user exactly as I did here. It goes through the same code at the lowest level under the hood and will automatically wire this up. So we saw the automatic wiring up before. What I haven't got at the moment is the ability to do the Active Directory search. As I said, the UI for that's not built, so I can't show you that bit working. But in theory, if I was creating the user, I could also explicitly add that directory entry instead of relying on it matching the username. So SpongeBob could have some completely different username in Octopus than his actual SAM account name in Active Directory, if you wanted to. Does that make sense to everyone? Has anyone got any questions? My apologies to Jess if she's having heart failures over the UI. The UI's only come together in the last day or so, and I haven't run it past Jess yet.
Shannon, yeah. If the same account on the Active Directory does not match the username that you specified first, which one do you use to log in?
You can use either. So if I was to go, if I was to sign out, and if I come over here, now that particular SpongeBob doesn't actually have an account at octopus.com, so I can't physically actually do this. But if I put SpongeBob in here and his Active Directory username, password, he can log in. If I've specified a username, password username for him, he could also use that here. When you log in with this Forms Auth, we actually interrogate all of the enabled auth providers. And if any of them say, yes, that's a valid user, here it is, then we accept it. So it sort of falls back through them. So if the username if password says, no, I don't recognize SpongeBob, but Active Directory does, then you'll log in as that and it'll work.
Do we support Kerberos? Like if people have logged on as part of a domain, they just inherit that identity in their browser?
Yes, that was actually what I just did then. Sorry, I'll go back and do that again. So the sign in with a domain account here is the Kerberos style challenge that will just log you in as who I'm logged in as in Windows. If you put the username password here, then you sign in with those values using that sign in button. Otherwise, use this challenge one. Something else we've had since 3.5, for those who don't know, is if I clicked the wrong button, sorry. If you only have a single auth provider enabled, so if you enable just Active Directory and you disable the Forms auth, which some users often do, so these fields here disappear and you just get that button. There is also an option to then say auto login in that scenario. So essentially we look at the things that are enabled, and if there's only one thing and it's only got a button, you can do the same with Google Apps. So if we disabled username, password, and Active Directory and just left Google Apps enabled, we can then switch on the auto login feature, and the users never see this screen. We basically just push this button, essentially just push that button there for you and take you straight through.
Shannon, the sign in with Google, how does that work with two-factor authentication?
If you've got two-factor auth enabled on your Google Apps account that you sign in with, then you'll have to do that before it will redirect you back to here. So it's completely outside of our control. We don't have to worry about any of it. That all happens on the identity provider side.
Shannon, quick question about the user name authentication.
Yep.
If it's disabled, then when you create a user, I can imagine those two password fields will disappear?
At the moment, no, they don't, because we assume that you could switch the provider back on later. Remember, you can switch the provider on and off dynamically while the server's running. And one of the things we didn't want was things like that getting in the way. So if you set a password, then the password provider will use it if it's enabled. We don't stop you from setting it if it's not enabled. Whether we should or not, I guess, is up for grabs. But the other interesting thing.
Just one more thing. I'm just thinking more kind of farther on identities, and I'm wondering if username and password can be treated as a type of identity, or we want to treat it differently.
It is treated differently because it's not external. The other external ones have some different mechanics that are involved, and none of the others have to manage passwords because they're by nature, they're external. So they have completely different attributes. They don't do, we know that we hand off or validation, then mechanically they work so differently that we decided not to try and mangle them to support passwords.
Mm-hmm.
Is it worth making them appear as an identity in the UI, even if they're not implemented that way? Just so that you can, so it's easy to see that, okay, this user can log in using method A, B, or C?
Yeah, we might be able to model it in the UI to look like that.
I think it'll make it clearer.
Yep. So then this wouldn't really be external identities. This would fall back to just being identities, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some benefits to that. I'll have a look at that, see what we can do with the UI in that front.
Shannon, I started modeling like that in the V4 one, so I called them auth providers, and the Octopus one is there. So yeah, we can explore it further.
Yeah.
It was one single component with all the providers.
Yeah, again, we can work ways around it. At the moment, this is just a generic read-only panel. We can add other custom panels in there. The idea is this information in here is always read-only. You can't edit any of it once it's created. Like once you said that this is the Google Apps identity for this user, you can delete it if you want, but you can't edit this anymore. When the user logs in with that account, we actually check the display name and we'll update it if it's not right according to the identity provider, but only the back end can actually do that at the point when the user logs in. So these fields are by design all read-only. You'll also notice there's some duplicates, so that if you've got different display names in Active Directory and Google App, for example, you'll see those here. When we create the user, something else we've added in 3.17 is the ability at each provider level to disable automatic user creation, which is a feature that a few users have been asking for quite a while. So for those who've used Active Directory or Google Apps, if you show up, if those providers are enabled and you can log in, then you are assumed to be someone we trust, and we'll create a user record automatically for you in the background if you don't already exist. That in past has had some side effects. It can rapidly increase the number of users, which creates problems in the licensing space. And for security reasons, some people would like to disable that. So one of the things I've added in 3.17 is the ability to do that. And you can disable it individually for Active Directory and Google Apps and as your AD. For info on that, you look at the configure command line options. Those things, it's listed there as one of the things you can enable and disable now. So what that would mean is that SpongeBob wouldn't actually be able to automatically log in with his Google Apps account unless I've come in and added this to his record in advance. So we've got a number of users who've asked us for that particular feature.
Can I add SpongeBob without going through the UI?
Sorry, Matt?
Can I add SpongeBob without doing it manually in the UI? I've downloaded a spreadsheet of all the Google Apps users in this group, and all of them should get access.
The user APIs, the user APIs work the way they always did. The user object just has an identities list on it now. So if you're able to shape the JSON the right way to make that represent those identities, you could definitely do that.
API is there. I did the PowerShell and you're done.
A bit, yes.
Yes.
Hey Shannon, what happens if the Active Directory same account name gets renamed and clashes with an existing user on our local?
If the Active Directory, which gets renamed?
Same account name gets renamed and clashes with an existing user name.
Someone was talking about guns and shooting themselves before. I can't stop you from doing that. If that would mean that in Active Directory you have swapped two users' same account names.
Yeah.
And that feels bad. I don't know if anyone would actually do that, but if you have done that, then Active Directory is going to have an equally difficult time.
Was the question that if you've got an existing username and password user and you add the Active Directory component and somebody logs in with the same email address, essentially, are they two different users?
Same user. So if you've got an email address up here and it matches the email address that we get from Active Directory, we will assume that it's the same person. So there's a few fields that we consider to be unique identifiers. Email is one of them, and username's the same. If you have a username that happens to be the same as your UPN from Active Directory, we will assume that is the same person, even if they don't have this information yet. What we will do when we recognize that, and that's pretty much exactly what happened when I created SpongeBob earlier. It went through and checked the usernames and went, hey, that's actually someone that I recognize by that username, so I'll add this to it.
Yeah, that was a problem prior to 3.5. That if you were on username and password and you switched to Active Directory, you ended up with everybody as duplicate users and you had to remanage all your teams. So that was an important part here, was to be able to say, switch it on and then recognize the duplicates and merge them together.
Yeah. Shannon, did you get we were talking about breaking changes for V4, did you manage to get it all into 3.17 without the API breaking? Or is there still some more stuff coming?
There's some stuff I've still got to eval. So I've been running this and switching back and forward between this branch and master and not having to change my database. It automatically merges the data in both directions. So the API I've got to revisit and just double check that we haven't caused any significant breaking changes there, but the data objects themselves are resilient to whether this identities list is here or not. Yep. So it seems to be fairly resilient too. If you have an old client sending me data, sending us data, it should still work out what's going on, because that's exactly the same as what I did when I created SpongeBob before through the UI.
Great. Yeah, that's perfect.
So in all the testing I've done so far, it's resilient to the version differences. So there are differences in the API, but it doesn't seem to break anything that I can find yet. That's part of what our testing tomorrow and Friday is going to be about. There was one other thing I was going to mention then. What was that? Oh, sorry. Yes, I mentioned earlier there's identifying fields, or under the hood I've called these things claims, but they're just properties. They're things about the identity that we know. So in an Active Directory scenario, UPN and SAM account name are both identifying properties. The display name is just there for information. In Google Apps, your email address is an identifying property. There is another one under the hood, but it's a private ID thing that we don't ever display to the users. It's only stored in the server. We get it from Google and we keep it secret because it's not meant to be reflected back to the user ever. However, when in part answer to Rob's question, we look through the email address, the username fields. We also look through any identifying fields. So if you log in and we can line up the data value for any of the identifying fields, then we'll assume that's you. So if in response to, say, John's question, where the administrator's been through and changed this particular user's SAM account name to something else, but they haven't changed his UPN, we'll still recognize that it's the same user because one of the identifying fields matches. So we assume that all of these are unique, and if any of them match, it's the same person. To make us resilient to sysadmin has changed all the SAM account names over the weekend and broken all the users, which, like Mike said, used to result in us duplicating users all over the place because we suddenly didn't recognize people. So we've tried to make it far more resilient to recognizing the multiple unique identifiers that can be sent to us. Similarly, so by the same token, if the UPNs change but the SAM account names didn't, we still line the data up. When it lines it up and the data is changed, we do update it in here, so we keep the latest copy. So we'll sort of self-heal the data that we have, that we know about the user. which helps us optimize the search next time they log in.
I think that helps with when you're merging domains or adding new trusts and things like that.
Yep.
Or deduplication, I should say.
Yep. Yes, it will help with the other scenarios, like I've picked all my users up and shifted them to another part of the forest, but their SAM account name's still the same. So their UPN may have shifted because they're now in some other part of the network, which gives them a different UPN. But if their SAM account name's the same, they'll all just keep working.
Yep. You can sort of see a few hours of support time has been spent figuring all this out.
Yeah.
2 or 3.
Yep.
Cool. Very good. Nice work. I think that's it for today, hey?
I think that's all.
317 is a chunky release now.
It is indeed.
Yeah.
Lots of good stuff in there. Beautiful. Well, see you all later on.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
See you, everybody.
So that's really good.